Welcome to episode 9 of Toke TV, your source for the biggest cannabis and hemp news stories of the week. I'm Steve Elliott, editor of TokeSignals.com and your host. I will take you through the news, but first let's take a look at our Toke TV Bud Pick of the Week. This week we have some tasty Super Lemon Haze. Found this at a place in Bremerton, Washington, their third storefront dispensary that I know of, called Top Green Meds, and this was $10 a gram. It had those wonderful lemon terpenes happening. It is a sativa strain, so it's a good daytime strain, good pain relief, good nausea relief, yet it's high energy and it doesn't put you to sleep the way an indica can do. So this is good working medicine, $10 a gram from Top Green Meds. Our good medicine of the week is CBD capsules from the CPC. CBD from the CPC. This is a South Seattle dispensary. These pills are terpene enhanced. The terpenes, which naturally occur in cannabis flowers, potentiate the effects of the cannabinoids. It's almost as if nature had a plan for us to use this healing plant. The unfortunate fact, though, is when concentrates are extracted from cannabis flowers through solvents such as butane, as is used with BHO, which stands for butane hash oil, we lose a lot of those subtle terpenes. They're quite delicate, and many of them are lost in the extraction process. Well, a lot of the folks in the medical marijuana community, including those good folks at the CPC, have had the great idea of adding back in terpenes from plant sources because they do potentiate the effects of the cannabinoids, the therapeutic effects. So they have what they call terpene enhanced capsules. They have CBD capsules, they have sativa dominant, and they have indica dominant capsules, all terpene enhanced, $10 per 4-pack. The 4 pills together represent a 1 gram dosage of cannabis. Let's do the news. We had a big story this week, again, concerning Attorney General Holder. He has expanded on his reform of mandatory minimum sentences for drug laws, and he has gone beyond his earlier expansion. He has ordered prosecutors now to remove any reference to quantities of illicit drugs that trigger mandatory minimums and to apply these provisions to pending cases. He seems to be more and more serious about actually doing something about the exploding prison population in the United States, which is partly, and even possibly you could say largely, due to the drug laws. Attorney General Holder and the Obama administration are continuing to push for these reforms of the draconian drug sentencing policies that have resulted in this exploding prison population over the past 3 decades. The White House announced that they will curtail federal mandatory minimum drug laws by ordering prosecutors to remove references to specific amounts of illegal drugs that trigger the sentences, and to refile charges against defendants in pending cases and apply that new policy to defendants who are already in the system but have not yet been sentenced. Ethan Nadelman, executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, takes a very positive view of this development. I must say I'm impressed at the speed and specificity with which Mr. Holder has followed up on last month's comments, Nadelman said. This looks like a major good faith effort to reform federal drug sentencing laws as much as possible, given the constraints of federal law and judicial prerogative over sentencing. Now, according to the New York Times, this policy applies to defendants who meet 4 criteria. Their offense did not involve violence. It did not involve the use of a weapon. It did not involve selling drugs to minors. They're not leaders of a criminal organization, have no significant ties to large-scale gangs or drug trafficking organizations, and they have no significant criminal histories. Anthony Papa, who is media manager at the Drug Policy Alliance, had to serve a 12-year sentence under New York State's harsh Rockefeller drug laws before receiving clemency from the governor. And here's what Mr. Papa said. In my case, the judge said he didn't want to give me such a long sentence, but his hands were tied. Mandatory minimums are a costly and counterproductive cookie-cutter approach that bind a judge's ability to apply a meaningful sentence that will address the offense and provide for public safety. That's a quote from Anthony Papa. He did 12 years for drugs in New York State Prison. This follows up on Attorney General Holder's announcement in August of major federal sentencing changes, which we reported on at the time, including dropping the use of mandatory minimum sentencing in certain drug cases, expediting the release of certain nonviolent elderly prisoners, leaving more offenses to state courts to deal with rather than federal, and working with Congress to pass bipartisan sentencing reform. It's past time for Congress to take action and end the draconian practice of mandatory minimum sentencing, said Jasmine Tyler. She's Deputy Director of National Affairs there at the Drug Policy Alliance. We had a big development in Washington State this week, a Supreme Court decision. The Washington State Supreme Court this week upheld the medical necessity defense for growing marijuana. This particular case could have far-reaching implications, though it was a divided 5-4 decision from the Washington Supreme Court. This happened on Thursday, September 19th. They upheld a medical necessity defense in a marijuana cultivation case against a man who was fined $4,000 3 years ago for growing 42 marijuana plants. According to the decision, a prior medical marijuana authorization is not necessary in Washington State in order to claim a medical necessity defense for cannabis. This 5-4 ruling sends the case of William Kurtz back to Thurston County Superior Court for further action. Mr. Kurtz uses a wheelchair due to a medical condition that causes him chronic pain. He was fined but not sent to jail by Judge Carol Murphy in October 2010. The majority decision Thursday was written by Chief Justice Barbara Madsen, and she was of the opinion that Washington's Medical Use of Marijuana Act, as approved by voters 15 years ago in 1998, does not abrogate the common law allowing a medical necessity defense. This ruling means basically that those who are arrested for cannabis possession or growing can now claim medical necessity even if they don't have a prior medical marijuana authorization from a healthcare professional. Now, of course, if they claim medical necessity in court, they will need to provide medical evidence of a need. But the fact that they don't have to go through the bureaucracy of having a prior authorization means that more people will be able to apply this medical necessity defense than would otherwise be the case. In Oregon, we have 2 marijuana legalization initiative petition drives starting off strong. This national wave of marijuana law reform really is gaining momentum every day, and it's not going to leave Oregon behind. More than 30,000 people came to the Hemp Stalk Festival in Portland on September 7th and 8th, the 9th annual Hemp Stalk Festival, and more than 5,000 of those people signed both petitions, the 2 marijuana initiative petitions, while they were there. Initiative 21 would amend the Oregon Constitution, ending criminal penalties for cannabis and permitting adult recreational marijuana use, possession, and cultivation. Initiative 22, the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act 2014, would create a commission to regulate the cultivation, processing, and sale of marijuana, and it would, according to its sponsors, generate hundreds of millions of dollars for the Oregon General Fund, helping to pay for schools, roads, and social services. The group's Hemp in Oregon stands for Help End Marijuana Prohibition in Oregon, and the Campaign for the Restoration and Regulation of Hemp have kicked off a vigorous volunteer and paid petition drive to get both initiatives on the ballot for November 2014, according to Director Paul Stanford. Marijuana prohibition does not work and is expensive to maintain, Stanford said. We must move forward on a better path for hemp and marijuana in Oregon. Some Oregon lawmakers, like Representative Phil Barnhart from Eugene, a Democrat, agree that marijuana prohibition doesn't work. Barnhart is pushing the Democratic Party leadership in Oregon to form a bicameral committee to study the impact of cannabis legalization revenue, criminal justice, and healthcare in the state. Meanwhile, House Minority Leader Representative Mike McLean, a Republican from Powell Butte, Oregon, told the Statesman Journal last week that legislators might write their own marijuana legalization bill. McLean's thinking is that way, the lawmakers could ensure it passes, quote, with the oversight and protections lawmakers want, unquote, rather than continuing to simply oppose any form of legalization. If you want to get involved in those petition drives in Oregon, you can visit hemp.org and they can tell you how to sign up. We have a study from the FBI this week that shows marijuana arrests are continuing at near record levels despite the shift in public opinion. Throughout 2012, the vast majority of marijuana arrests were for simple possession. Nationwide, police in the United States conduct one drug arrest every 20 seconds and one marijuana arrest every 42 seconds. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's annual Uniform Crime Report, an estimated 749,824 arrests were made nationwide for marijuana. More than 87% of those were for possession only. That's a slight decrease from 2011. Marijuana arrests accounted for nearly half of all drug arrests in 2012. Monday's FBI report shows that 42.4% of all drug arrests were for marijuana possession. Possession-only cases constitute, as we said, more than 87% of all marijuana cases. The report noted that 59.9% of rapes, 53.2% of all violent crimes, and 81% of property crimes reported in 2012 were unsolved or did not result in any arrests. Meanwhile, one person is arrested for marijuana possession every 48 seconds on average in the United States. That is a criminal misuse, if you'll excuse the term, of the police force, with all these serious actual crimes going unsolved while they're busy busting potheads. Back in April, a Pew Research poll reported that a majority of Americans think marijuana should be taxed and regulated similar to alcohol. Dan Riffle of the Marijuana Policy Project said, instead of punishing and stigmatizing responsible adult marijuana users, we should be focusing on serious crime. As a former prosecuting attorney myself, Riffle said, I believe it is irresponsible to squander our limited law enforcement forces on this disastrous public policy failure. This is especially true when so many violent crimes remain unsolved, Riffle said. Every second spent arresting and prosecuting adults for marijuana is time that could have been spent preventing and solving real crimes. The numbers beyond that represent a tremendous loss of human potential, and that's pointed out by Law Enforcement Against Prohibition Executive Director Neil Franklin. He was a cop for 34 years on the streets of Baltimore. Commit a murder or a robbery, and the government will still give you a student loan, Franklin pointed out. Get convicted for smoking a joint, and you're likely to lose it. This is supposed to help people get over their drug habit. Every time a police officer makes an arrest for drugs, that's several hours out of his or her day not spent going after real criminals, said Diane Goldstein, another LEAP speaker. As the country has been investing more and more of its resources into prosecuting drug crime, the rate of unsolved violent crime has been steadily increasing. Where are our priorities here? From Michigan this week, we have a heartbreaking case where a baby girl was removed from her home, taken from her parents, simply because they were medical marijuana patients. No other reason. Groups supporting Michigan's medical marijuana law are joining forces now to protest this case of this 6-month-old Lansing girl who was removed from her home after a complaint involving medical marijuana use by her parents. Dozens of people held signs and chanted "Free Bree" outside the Grand Tower in Lansing on Tuesday to protest the Michigan Department of Human Services removal of Brielle Green from her parents, Steve and Maria Green. These are good parents, good loving parents, said Charmy Golson, founder of Michigan Moms United, one of the groups organizing Tuesday's press conference. The Green case is just one among dozens in which state caseworkers have ignored patient protections in the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act while trying to remove children from parents who are registered medical marijuana patients or caregivers, according to Golson. There's nowhere to go when Children's Protective Services does this, Golson said. When they took Bree on Friday, that really was the last straw. An Ingham County Family Court referee, acting on a petition by CPS caseworkers on Friday, ordered the infant removed from her parents' home because her mother, a registered legal medical marijuana caregiver, had cannabis in the house. The referee claimed the marijuana creates a dangerous situation, quote unquote, because someone with a gun could break in. And that's according to the father, Steve Green. A DHS spokesman wouldn't discuss the Green case, citing privacy rules. Now, the CPS petition involving his daughter grew out of a custody visitation dispute between Green's wife and her ex-husband involving another child, according to Steve Green. Maria Green's ex-husband filed a complaint with CPS claiming her home was unfit for children. When caseworkers visited the home and asked to inspect it, the Greens refused to allow them into their grow room without a court order, because there's a provision in Michigan's medical marijuana law that says only one person can have access to that room, according to the Greens' attorney, Joshua Covert. Caseworkers then went to court and asked for the child to be removed. That puts the parents between a rock and a hard place. Either you break the law or we take your children away, Covert said. Bree has been placed with a relative, according to the Greens. The protests continue in Michigan, and hopefully she'll soon be returned to her rightful home. In Kentucky, a bit of good news, as hemp production is moving closer to reality there. Staff members, in fact, have been instructed to begin the process of writing rules for the development of the long-band industrial hemp crop in Kentucky, according to a news release from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. The state's Industrial Hemp Commission is calling on GOP Agriculture Commissioner James Comer and Republican U.S. Senator Rand Paul to write a letter to the U.S. Department of Justice to make Kentucky's intentions known. Paul and Comer are hoping for clarity from the feds on the current legality of growing the hemp crop in Kentucky. The issue remains murky in the wake of a DOJ memo released last month by Deputy Attorney General James Cole. Now, according to that August 30th memo, the federal government will respect state marijuana laws, which advocates believe includes the legalization of industrial hemp production. Senator Rand Paul intends to be a part of correspondence with the Department of Justice, according to his spokesperson, and he supports the work of the Hemp Commission and supports Commissioner Comer's efforts to move forward with the reintroduction of industrial hemp in Kentucky. Rand Paul has donated $25,000 to the Hemp Commission through his Rand PAC. This commission has been operating primarily on a $50,000 contribution from David Bronner, who is CEO of Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps, hemp-based natural soaps. And that donation from David Bronner was received less than a week after the commission's first meeting. Comer had sent a previous letter to the DOJ earlier this year urging the federal government to lift its prohibition on industrial hemp. That letter was signed by a lot of prominent Kentucky politicians, including Senator Paul, Senator Mitch McConnell, and Democratic Representative John Yarmouth, as well as Republican Representative Thomas Massey, but the letter was roundly ignored. 7 out of 8 of our federal delegation, they never got a response from DOJ, Comer said. So we're going to try Plan B. We're just going to send them a letter saying, okay, this is what we're going to do unless you tell us otherwise. The Kentucky General Assembly passed Senate Bill 50 in the 2013 regular session. That allows the creation of a regulatory framework for Kentucky hemp production should the federal government lift its ban on cultivation. According to Holly Harris, who is Comer's chief of staff, because Senate Bill 50 separates the legal definition of hemp from that of marijuana, then hemp is legal at the state level in Kentucky. She said Deputy Attorney General Cole's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee last week that the DOJ will not prosecute hemp farmers in states where the crop is legal further legitimizes the Hemp Commission's plans to go forward with the permitting process. Paul and Comer plan to draft their letter soon, according to Harris. The letter will be the latest bid by Comer to lobby the feds to allow the growing of hemp for industrial and research purposes. The nonpartisan Congressional Research Service in July released a study which estimated the potential domestic market for hemp production to be $500 million a year. That could be a real economic shot in the arm for Kentucky if they can get industrial hemp farming restarted there. It used to be a major hemp producing state before such production was outlawed. Our final story this week is from Toke Signals, Medical Marijuana 31 years later. A question. The federal government has given a Florida man 126,000 joints free since 1982, 300 a month, just like clockwork. Herb Rosenfeld, a 58-year-old stockbroker from Fort Lauderdale, doesn't look like a record-setting pothead, but he smoked more than 126,000 U.S. government joints in the past 31 years. On November 20th, 1982, the U.S. federal government sent Rosenfeld 300 cannabis cigarettes in a shiny tin can. The delivery of that medicine was part of the Compassionate Investigative New Drug Program, which exists to study new drugs, in this case, marijuana. 3 other survivors of that original program, including activist LV Musica, still get their monthly tens of joints as well. Over that 31-year period, the government hasn't performed any study, which was the stated reason for the existence of the program, the Compassionate Investigative New Drug Program. Now, that program was discontinued when the HIV crisis started in the early 80s. Ronald Reagan was president at the time, and they saw clearly that the program was about to be overwhelmed with thousands of HIV patients. So rather than accommodate the needs of all those people, they just shut the program down. However, they kept the original participants. There are 4 survivors 30 years later, and they all 4 still get their tens of 300 joints per month. Now, Irvin Rosenfeld will begin his 32nd year of smoking these joints on November 20th of this year, and he says he feels great. Having used cannabis for a serious illness for almost 3 decades puts me in the record books as the longest in-your-face proof that medical cannabis policy in the U.S. is illogical and mean, Herb said from his stock brokerage office, where he is senior vice president of investments. While smoking cannabis is derided by my federal government, I have suffered no negative consequences from the experimentation, unobserved by them, that they have allowed me and 3 others to participate in, Herb said. Herb and the 3 other federal cannabis patients were medically examined by Patients Out of Time. This nonprofit organization assumed the responsible agency, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the NIDA, would never dare conduct such study, fearing rightfully that the findings would likely be and were found to be very positive for all 4 patients. Such a study is regarded by Congress to have never been completed, yet the Patients Out of Time study was published in 2002 and can be found at www.medicalcannabis.com. It is known as the Missoula study, if you would like to look for it. When the medical team finished their extensive 3-day-long study of my health, they declared me in excellent condition for my age and affliction, Rosenfeld said. For the federal government to continually assert that there is no adequate science proving therapeutic value to cannabis is absurd. I stand as a living, breathing example of just how wrong they are and how disingenuous their statements about the medical utility of cannabis have become, said Rosenfeld, who suffers from the painful condition cartilaginous exostosis. This causes tumors to form on his joints. I intend to live another 30 years, and I hope to see all patients afforded the same health care option that my government affords me, Herb said. Please excuse me, it's time to take my medicine. Herb's on the board of directors of Patients Out of Time, a 501c3 educational charity, as are the other 3 federally supplied cannabis patients. And it's worth noting that this same federal government that has for more than 30 years been sending these free joints out every month considers cannabis to be a Schedule I drug with no medical uses. There's an interesting clash there, and the facts don't seem to agree with each other. We have to ask ourselves, as this media conundrum continues, is the U.S. government telling us the truth when it continues to claim that marijuana is a dangerous Schedule I drug and must be prohibited for any use? Or do we believe the tens of thousands of patients like Herb Rosenfeld and the science that supports their lives? Let's take a couple of stories that we shouldn't miss this week, our must-read stories. The first one is from Ron Marksick, our worth repeating guy, former cop, former health teacher, former RN, and he is a marijuana expert in every sense of that term. Ron tells us this week about suicide rates, which fall in medical marijuana states, according to a 2011 scientific study. The conclusions of that study were: we conclude that the legalization of medical marijuana leads to an improvement in the psychological well-being of young adult males, an improvement that is reflected in fewer suicides. That's some fascinating stuff, and it's yet another ancillary benefit of medical marijuana legalization that a lot of people don't think about. That's worth taking a look at on Toke Signals this week. Suicide rates fall in medical marijuana states. Worth repeating. The other must-read story I'd like to point out to you this week is high IQ linked to drug use, according to a decades-long British study. Now, the next time some buzzkill tries to hit you with the old drooling stoner stereotype, tell them about this 2011 British study. It found children with high IQs are more likely to use drugs as adults than are people who score low on IQ tests as children. So you want to take the time to find out about that study if you want some good arguing points next time you get into one of those debates with your friends. Now, don't forget, next time you have a beautiful cannabis flower and you want to preserve that thing for the ages, before you smoke it, take its pictures, send it in, make it famous. We'll make it our bud pick of the week. It'll be preserved forever, and you can remember how pretty that thing was before you smoked it. Send it on in. We're always happy to look at the pretty flowers with you. Until next week's episode, my advice to you is to stay lifted. I'll see you then.